Okay, so here we are trying to look at an example of a common behavior in terms of what's as a control process and what's involved. Okay, so what we're the control variable, which is called QI, is the position of a cup. It's a variable, and what control involves is keeping that variable in an intended pre-selected state, right? When you take a sip, the main intended state of that variable is having the cup at your lips to take a drink, right? The intended state of the variable is the reference state, okay, and that's called R star. And so the reference position of the variable, the cup position, is at your lips. Okay. The disturbances that affect that, the things that make it different, that affect how well you can get it to your lips, the main one is gravity. And gravity determines how much force you have to exert with your muscles to lift the cup to your lips, right? Okay. It turns out that getting the cup to your lips consistently, which is what we do, is a control process, because we keep getting the cup to your lips, and you don't put it over here, or throw it over your shoulder, or put it over your head. You always consistently get it to the reference state at your lips, despite the fact that the effect of gravity is varying each time. And you know why? Because the contents of the cup is going down. So it weighs a different amount each time. And that means if you used exactly the same lifting forces each time you took a sip, after about the second sip, you would be throwing it over your head, right? So what you're doing is producing this consistent result in the context of varying disturbances. The varying disturbances being the varying effects of gravity on that thing. Now that seems like a trivial example, but everything we are doing as we move about the world is a control process. We are adjusting outputs in terms of muscle forces and all kinds of things like that to produce these nice, consistent results that you see. I think you can get a sense of how amazingly skillfully we are controlling just our movements, but we're controlling many other things, as I'll show you, but how skillfully we're doing this controlling, so that basically controlling becomes invisible. It looks like we just behavior just pops out of us. We just lift a glass, or we open a book, or we call on the phone, call for a date, or whatever it is we do it with such grace and ease, usually, except when things go wrong, and then we have to go see a therapist. But our controlling is usually very skillful, because we are producing what we intend to produce, these reference states, by very skillfully manipulating our outputs, like our muscle movements, to get those reference states to happen. One way of seeing how incredibly wonderful that is, what we're doing invisibly, is if you look at robots that are designed. Now, robots have been designed to do some very clever things, but they don't do them like people yet. But regardless of the goodness or badness of that, the point is that they have trouble developing robots to produce behaviors like walking. Imagine how we walk on this changing terrain regularly, adjusting our position and our forces that we're exerting to keep ourselves completely easily balanced. We almost never trip or stumble. And there is no robot that can do that. You've got robots that can walk, but they have to be, you know, they're in limited environments that they can walk. They can't go on a hiking trail, you know, after they've been walking down Hollywood Boulevard or something. They are limited in their ability to control. Okay, so anyway, so control is what we do. Behavior is control. I don't know if I want to spend too much time because I think I'm already going, but what I like to do when I teach this in class is have students look at examples of any kind of behavior that you can name and try to look at it in terms of these components of control. Like when you lift a book, what's the controlled variable? It's similar to lifting a cup of tea. It's to get the book in a position where you want to read it. What are the disturbances? Again, it's gravity. And what is the reference state at the right position? And what are the outputs? Again, it's muscle forces. Riding a bike, the controlled variable is your center of gravity relative to the bike, probably. The disturbances are, again, the forces of gravity that are differentially exerted depending on the slant of your bike. And the outputs that compensate for those disturbances are how you turn the wheel. It takes a while to learn how to do that, but when you learn how to ride a bike, it's like you're not doing anything. You're just turning the wheel just enough to keep your center of gravity right over. Driving a car, well, there's several controlled variables when you drive a car. You want to control the speed of the car, the position of the car relative to the other cars. You do it by hitting the gas or the brake. The disturbances are, you know, how fast the other cars are going relative to you and things like that. You control for maintaining a relationship with a loved one, right? And so what is the variable involved? Well, there's lots of variables involved in relationships that you want to control, but one of them surely is how loving it is. Right? So how nice things feel, let's say, or how calm it is, or whatever. There are different aspects of a relationship that you want to control, and so you try to get those things. Those are variables. So the relationships can go from cold to hot, and in terms of lovingness, and so you have a reference for how loving you want it to be, because it can get too loving. But you have some reference for where you want that to be. You control it by doing various things, bringing flowers or bringing whatever. You do things to try to, and the disturbances are how the other person acts relative to you. So we're controlling all the time. Everything we do, every behavior you can name is, when you look at it, is in fact a case of controlling. So control is what it's about. Control is what we do. So control isn't a dirty word until you start trying to control other people, and we'll get to that maybe a little. That's when control is bad, especially when you're the other person being controlled. So I just want you to know that I don't think control is always a great thing, but control is just a phenomenon. It's a more technical word for purposeful behavior. We are purposeful creatures. That's all. Perceptual control theory is a theory that explains how we control. That's all. So control, our controlling, all the stuff we do, playing chess or video games, I guess now, everything we do is controlling, and perceptual control theory is just the explanation of how that's done. It's an explanation of purposeful behavior. I should point out that this isn't such a problem probably I know it's not a problem in the therapeutic community, because people who are trained as therapists take it for granted that people are purposeful systems that are purposeful. But in scientific psychology, purpose is a dirty word. You will not find it in the index of any psychological textbook. The word purpose is scary to scientific psychologists because it sounds unscientific. Purpose is a problem. And that's why perceptual control theory has had a problem in conventional psychology. But anyway, perceptual control theory was developed by Bill Powers, William T. Powers, and described in his book, Behavior, the Control of Perception, which is the book I saw in the library as I was leaving after I got my PhD, but didn't read it, but the title got me. I don't know if it gets you, but if you were trained in conventional psychology in a psychology department and you're trained to be a research psychologist, the way you thought about things was perception controls what we do. It inputs our perceptions, and if anything, perception controls behavior. So when you walk through the library and see a book called Behavior, the Control of Perception, you pay attention. You say, what? And that's what I did, although I didn't have time at the time, right after I got out of, to do it, but so I came back to it, as I said. It was about 4 years after the book came out, in 74, and 78 is when I got back into, and read the book, and became obsessed with it. Control theory already existed. Powers didn't invent control theory. It already existed in engineering, and it's a big, scary field that's got a lot of mathematics in it, and it's and it's very mechanistic. And it's been applied in psychology ever since World War II. It was applied to understanding how. In the field I actually went into, called human factors engineering, it was applied to understanding how pilots can better control their airplanes and things like that. But it turns out that it was applied in the wrong way. It's possible to use theories incorrectly, and back in the day there, right after World War II, psychology was heavily steeped in behaviorism, and behaviorism says that inputs cause outputs, perception controls behavior. So control theory was used to explain how perception results in behavior, and they were using all these complex mathematics to look at these relationships between stimuli and responses, and they were able to do that for reasons that I now understand, but I won't go into. Just for now, what you can know is up until Bill Powers came along, control theory was existing in psychology, but they were doing the wrong thing with it. Powers was able to apply control theory correctly. Powers actually was trained. He was trained as a physicist of all things, and he learned about control systems because he was actually he was in the Navy in World War II, and in fact, a little known anecdote, he was on in the armada that was going over for the invasion of Japan. And he was going to be one of the people who set up the little lamps on the beach that would illuminate things for the invading army. And in other words, he was going to be a dead duck. And so and Bill was the most humane and wonderful person I've ever met. And he had very, very ambiguous feelings about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, but it saved his life. So that's the world. Anyway, so the Bill, after the war, and he had been trained in, he became very interested in behavior because he had his own post-war things to deal with. And he was able to apply control theory correctly, and the reason he was able to do that was because he was trained in physics, and he understood what I gave you a very abbreviated treatment of just now. He was able to understand that the things we see as behavior are not just things that pop out of you. We live in a physical world where we have to deal with these disturbances that are like varying effects of gravity on us and things like that. And he knew that when you just saw a person walking down the street, you weren't seeing just a person, that walking didn't just pop out of you. It had to be a controlled process. Something was going on. And so he knew that it had to be explained by control theory, and because he knew that behavior was control, he was able to apply the theory correctly. So I think, okay, so here's the theory. So this is why you might get scared by it, but this is a basic diagram of a control system, and I'll try to describe how this works. But I want to try to give in the book there are no diagrams, there's no math, there's no nothing, no symbols. I try to give a verbal description of how a control system works. But since we're talking about the theory, I'll go into a little more detail about it. The first thing to notice about this diagram is that the bottom half is called the environment. This is the aspect of behavior that we can see. This is, well, some of it. So what we certainly can see is the state of this controlled variable. So this is objectively observable. We can see that a person is keeping the cup coming to their lips. We can see that the person keeps taking steps without falling down. We see these, the things are being kept in reference states, and if we're a physicist, we often can see the invisible disturbances that would be having an effect on this if they weren't being compensated. So anyway, this is the world we can see, and it's basically what we're trying to explain. We're trying to explain, whoop, I did it. We're trying to explain why these variables in the world, the variable aspects of our behavior, how they are able to be kept in these reference states. So this is the phenomenon we're trying to understand, is the fact that we have the variables are being controlled by people. All right, and so this above the line is a theory. This is the theory, but it's consistent with what we know about people. This is presumably what's going on when we lift a cup consistently to our mouths. The first thing we have here is an input function. This is your sense system that perceives the cup. You have to see the cup in order to control it. That's okay. So so this input function is your sensory systems that transforms this cup out here into P, which is a perceptual signal. A perceptual signal is literally just an afferent neural signal. We know that the nervous system is made out of afferent neurons and efferent neurons. Do you know that? Is that? Well, anyway, and they go into the central nervous system, and efferent come out, afferent go in. So this is a sensory signal, basically, an afferent signal. And now this is where we get more into theory. In theory, this perceptual signal, the perception of the cup, is compared to another neural signal that's called the reference signal. This turns out, this little R, this reference signal, is is the whole big enchilada of this theory. This reference signal, which comes from higher parts of higher parts of the nervous system, is that's a specification for what the perception should be. It's this signal in you that's telling this perception to be at the lips. Okay, and what this is a synapse which implements a comparison process. It's really just subtracting the perceptual signal from the reference to see if there's a difference. Is there a difference between where the cup is and where I want it to be? That's all that is. This little box is just, that's all you have to do. It's comparing where the cup is near where I want it to be. If it's, to the extent that it's not, to the extent that there is a difference, you get this thing called an error signal. That's the actual efferent signal that drives the muscles. Okay? And so the efferent signal is converted by this output function into actual forces on the world. Okay? Now, in the world, those forces have an effect on the very thing that you're perceiving. So there's a closed loop of functions here, and verbally I have to describe this closed loop in a sequence. But the fact is, the best way to think of this, because all these things are happening over time, what's actually happening in this closed loop is that the output is continuously being pushed in the right direction so that the perception is really always being kept right at the reference. You're always in a closed loop. This perception is being kept at the reference, and so there's always very little error in actuality. There's a little bit of error when you first pick up the cup, but very quickly, because of the closed loop aspect of things, the perception is brought to the reference. So what's happening here in this closed loop is a closed loop system here. But what's happening, in the way I think about it, is this reference signal is causing the perception to be where it wants it to be. This reference signal is just a fancy name for a want. This is what I want. This is what I'm getting. So the control model of how you behave is that this is all happening in you specify what you want to experience, and once you specified it, assuming you're a good controller, it happens. So I specify that I'm going to step forward and make that happen, and each thing that happens, each specification is almost immediately happening, at least in the time frame of the particular kind of perception that you're controlling. But that's the way to think about a closed loop control system that you are, is that you are controlling, you are making a perception match your want. And that's why his book is called Behavior, the Control of Perception, because what is happening in a control loop like this is that this loop is controlling that guy, the perception. So when we're looking at people behave, what you're actually seeing from the outside is people acting, doing these outputs, to keep their perceptions of the world where they want them. And they're the ones who are setting these wants. So the perceptual control theory looks at people, or shows that people are what we always thought they were, autonomous. You set your own goals. Nobody can set your own wants for you. You're the one who's doing that. However, because of the fact that some of the perceptions you want to control are, or all of them, are affected also by disturbances, you have to act in certain ways to correct for those disturbances. So what we also see people doing is acting to compensate for disturbances at the same time. So what we're seeing on behavior is both variables being kept in reference states, and we're seeing often how they are being done. And that's the demo I'll get to in a second. But so this slide is just an attempt to give a verbal rehash of what is shown in this diagram. So controlling, what people do, according to perceptual control theory, is a closed loop negative feedback process. The negative feedback just refers to the fact that when I act to reduce the error in this loop, when I produce outputs in response to the error, I am canceling the error. I am negatively affecting the error. So if there's error, it'll drive the output to do things to the perception that reduce the error in the first place. So the feedback effect of my actions on my perceptions is to make any error I'm having less. And what that results in is keeping that perception at the reference. So that's what negative feedback control is. Just a quick diversion. Positive feedback is what you see when a microphone goes louder and louder and eventually just stops, right? Because what's happening is you're talking into the microphone, which is being amplified out of the speaker. The speaker picks up that amplified output into the microphone again. The microphone continues to amplify it, so the feedback is keeping on making the error bigger. That's positive feedback. So it turns out, it's an interesting thing about control theory, positive feedback is bad, negative feedback is good. But anyway, so controlling is a closed loop negative feedback process. It acts, what this loop is doing is keeping a perception of what you want to have happen, the intended result, matching your own in your head specification for where you want it. These reference specifications are neural signals in your brain that you set. The reference specification in this model, by the way, is equivalent to the set point on that thermostat, on a thermostat. When you set the temperature of the room with that little knob there, you are setting the reference temperature that guy wants to feel. But in the thermostat, the reference is accessible to you. You can control what that thermostat wants. You can make it want 70 degrees or 60 degrees or whatnot. It doesn't have any choice. You determine what it wants. In people, you can't do that. The reference signals are inside your head. That's what autonomy means. Nobody can set those references. They can tell you what to want, but that's just an annoyance, right? You are the only thing that has control over what you want. So, okay. So conventional psychology, that means all of scientific psychology, not so much therapy, clinical psychology. Conventional psychology really views the brain as a computer-like device that transforms what you get into what you do. All psychologies, behaviorism, cognitive, all psychology looks at the brain that way. It's an input-output device, which implies that ultimately perception is what controls what you do. Control theory views the brain as a provider of specifications for the way things should be, which is really, if you think about it, that's the way you are. You're not always conscious of that these specifications are existing, but that's what's happening, at least according to PCT, and it's consistent with experience, really. When you feel there's something you don't like, it's only because you have a reference for the way it should be. There's nothing intrinsically good or bad about anything out there of your experience. Okay? So if it seems like some things are intrinsically bad. I won't mention anything about our election, but some things just seem intrinsically bad. But they're not. They're only bad because they deviate from your reference for the way things should be. That's why there's so many people who think some of those things aren't bad. They have different references. It's exasperating, but that's the way it is. People have different little references and different specifications in their brain for the way things should be. Okay, so now, given that little thing, now I can show you how control theory explains how you can both be in control and controlled at the same time. And so I would like to have a volunteer from the audience come up. What's your name?
Casey.
Casey, okay. So, are we okay here?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what I'd like you to do, I guess I could whisper this in your ear, but I'll just give it away. All I want you to do is follow my finger with your finger, okay? So this is it. This is the whole demonstration. Now, from one point of view, you could look at this as Casey keeping his finger aligned with mine, which is what he's doing. The movement of my finger is a disturbance to the perception of the relationship between our finger, right? So when I move my finger, he moves his finger in order to keep it aligned, right? So you are controlling the alignment of our fingers, right? And you're protecting that perception from the disturbance that is my finger movements, right? But you can also see this as me controlling you.